Have you ever heard the thunder of a sold-out hockey arena go silent in awe of one man's incredible will? Imagine the roar of the crowd fading into an almost reverent hush as puck after puck slams into leg pads, rebounds off a chest protector, or ricochets off a battered, maskless face. And yet somehow, the goaltender remains unbreakable, holding the line when all logic says he should crumble. That man was Terry Sawchuk, arguably the greatest goalie to ever stand between the pipes, a legend whose exploits were hailed by teammates and feared by opponents. Behind the confident posture and record-setting performances, however, lay a secret tragedy, a lifelong struggle that would define his destiny as much as his historic shutouts and jaw-dropping saves. This is the story of the wounded warrior behind the mask, a story that blends triumph and torment, resilience and heartbreak in equal measure. Terry Sawchuk's legend began in Winnipeg, Manitoba, where harsh winters and backyard rinks molded him from a young age. Even before he hit his teenage years, you could tell he had a talent for net-minding, cat-like reflexes, a fearless approach to danger, and a willingness to fling his body in front of screaming slapshots. Yet the roots of his grit ran deeper than mere talent. He endured an avalanche of personal sorrows. His older brother died suddenly when Terry was a boy, and that sorrow weighed heavily on him. Some say it fueled his unrelenting determination to succeed in hockey, as though each save was a tribute to the brother he'd lost. By the time he turned pro with the Detroit Red Wings in 1949, Sawchuk was already honing a style that combined lightning-quick reactions with a stoicism coaches could only marvel at. But the NHL of the 1950s was a brutal proving ground for goalies. Picture an era of wooden sticks whipping pucks at alarming speeds, with players who'd think nothing of hacking at your shins or crashing your crease. Goaltenders wore almost no protective equipment, no mask, a flimsy chest protector, and minimal padding. Every game was a gauntlet. Sawchuk never flinched. His face, hit countless times by pucks, sticks, and elbows, became a tapestry of stitched-up wounds. He famously told reporters he had so many scars. A plastic surgeon once mapped them out like a puzzle, trying to piece together the mosaic of injuries. Yet, Terry just kept playing, piling up wins and rewriting the record books. He was unstoppable, even as he visibly paid the price in bruises and stitches after every game. Fans adored him for his iron will, while opponents practically felt cursed facing him in net. Sawchuk's signature was the belly flop style. He dropped to the ice with arms and legs splayed, an unorthodox approach that confounded shooters. He guarded the goal for the Red Wings dynasty of the early 1950s, capturing 3 Stanley Cups in 4 years. And let's not forget the legendary battles with the Montreal Canadiens, who boasted their own star netminder in Jacques Plante. Each clash was a study in contrasts. Plante wore a mask in the latter half of his career, revolutionizing the position's safety, while Sawchuk stubbornly refused protection until the mid-1960s. He seemed to embody the old-school hockey mentality. You played through pain, you never complained, and you never backed down. As the wins piled up, so did the accolades. By the late 1950s, sports writers touted Sawchuk as a once-in-a-lifetime goalie, comparing him to historical giants like Georges Vezina. Teammates spoke of him with an almost reverential awe. Yet behind the scenes, Terry wrestled with demons, chronic pain, bone-deep exhaustion, and a silent war with mental health challenges that the sports world at the time barely acknowledged. Depression, in particular, crept in, exacerbated by the physical wear and tear on his body. Close friends hinted at days when he could barely drag himself out of bed, let alone face a full-speed NHL game. His marriage became strained, and his personal life teetered on the edge of chaos. In 1964, after a stint with the Toronto Maple Leafs, Sawchuk's life took another turn. He helped Toronto secure the Stanley Cup, adding to his collection of hockey's ultimate prize. But the glory didn't erase his troubles. He grew increasingly reclusive, rarely granting interviews and often lashing out at those closest to him. This undercurrent of turmoil shaped how he performed on the ice. Ironically, while some argued his quickness had slipped a notch with age, he seemed more dogged than ever, almost as if the net was his sanctuary, the only place he could channel the storm inside him. Toronto fans embraced him as a hero, but behind the headlines about spectacular saves and improbable wins, Sawchuk's personal anguish grew fiercer. By the time he returned to Detroit for a second stint, the NHL itself was evolving. Younger goalies like Glenn Hall and Johnny Bower were making their mark, while Sawchuk's body bore the scars of 1,000 battles. He finally conceded to the era's changing norms and wore a mask, an iconic, ghost-like piece of fiberglass that concealed a battered face. Yet nothing could conceal the emotional wounds. Some nights, he'd be unstoppable, flashing glove saves that reminded fans why he was considered the gold standard. Other nights, he'd appear distant, as though ghosts from his past had robbed him of his concentration. The Red Wings tried to manage him, limiting his starts, but tensions built in the locker room. Sports writers whispered about alcohol issues, run-ins with teammates, and a sadness that never left his eyes. Still, in 1967, when the NHL expanded from 6 to 12 teams, the Los Angeles Kings eagerly selected Sawchuk in the expansion draft. He was older, yes, but how do you pass on a legend who still had some magic left? Early in that inaugural Kings season, Sawchuk delivered glimpses of the brilliance that had once dominated the league, but playing on a fledgling team exacted a heavy toll. Night after night, he faced shooting galleries. The losses weighed on him, and the West Coast press, not as reverent or knowledgeable about Original Six royalty, focused on every miscue. In 1968, the Kings traded him to the Detroit Red Wings, his third stint with the club that had once been his launching pad to greatness. This uneasy homecoming was overshadowed by the personal demons Sawchuk could no longer keep bottled up. By the spring of 1970, after a night of heavy drinking, he got into a heated argument with his New York Rangers teammate and roommate Ron Stewart. The details of that altercation remain murky, but it ended tragically. Sawchuk suffered internal injuries, and although he underwent surgery, he slipped into critical condition. Hockey fans across North America held their breath, hoping the man who'd battled everything from unstoppable slapshots to crippling depression would pull through one more time. But, for once, he couldn't make the save. On May 31st, 1970, Terry Sawchuk passed away at just 40 years old, leaving a hockey community in shock. Media coverage exploded. Rumors abounded. Was it a freak accident or something more sinister? No formal charges were laid against Stewart, and the case was ultimately ruled an accident. But the tragedy left an indelible scar on the NHL. Many players and fans felt a crushing sense of guilt. The league was just beginning to recognize the toll the game took on mental health. Sawchuk's death became a symbol of old-school hockey's failure to protect its own, both physically and emotionally. Critics pointed to how the no-mask bravado made him a cult hero on the ice, but left him psychologically isolated off it. Others argued that the NHL, owners, and even fans had consumed Sawchuk's genius and grit without considering the toll it took on his body and mind. In the ensuing years, Sawchuk's legacy reached near mythic proportions. Goaltenders adopted masks as a standard piece of equipment, partly to avoid the horrific facial injuries that had become Sawchuk's calling card, and partly as a nod to evolving norms about player safety. Younger fans, who'd never witnessed his acrobatic brilliance, learned his name through record books: 447 career wins, 103 shutouts, an NHL record for decades, and 4 Vezina trophies. Across the hockey world, he was immortalized as a pioneer, an unbreakable competitor who'd shaped the trajectory of goaltending, but only in more recent times have people begun to acknowledge the darker side of his story, the hidden anguish that fueled and ultimately consumed him. For some, Terry Sawchuk's life parallels that of other sports icons who burnt bright and faded too soon. Think of Lou Gehrig or Roberto Clemente. Like them, Sawchuk left a towering legacy of achievement, but he also left unanswered questions about what could have been, had circumstances, and perhaps the era itself, been kinder. If you compare Sawchuk to modern-day keepers like Martin Brodeur or Patrick Roy, the conversation gets fascinating. Those legends benefited from better equipment, refined training, and a league that slowly started to value player well-being. Sawchuk, by contrast, navigated a far more rugged NHL at a time when mental health was scarcely discussed, and physical harm was just part of the game. Still, in the pantheon of hockey legends, Sawchuk stands out for his contradictions: the unstoppable competitor who was haunted by an unshakable sorrow, the fearless netminder who felt fear creeping in off the ice, the man known for stoic silence while turmoil raged behind his guarded eyes. Today, younger fans watch highlight reels of his unbelievable saves and marvel at how a man could sacrifice his body so completely for the love of sport.
Older fans, those who saw him play in the flesh, recall the intensity that radiated from him in net, an almost transcendent focus that made it seem like nothing could break his concentration. And yet, break he did. Perhaps his greatest tragedy wasn't just the accident that claimed his life, but the unseen burden he carried for so many years, seldom shared or understood by those around him. If we can learn anything from Terry Sawchuk's story, it might be that even the fiercest warrior can be fighting an invisible battle. The battered face we saw was just a fraction of the pain he endured. Today's NHL has better medical care, sports psychologists, and protective equipment, but Sawchuk's tale remains a cautionary reminder that progress is a continual process, that behind every highlight reel, there may be struggles we can't begin to fathom. In the end, when we ask ourselves who Terry Sawchuk really was, perhaps the best answer lies somewhere between the shining champion who redefined goaltending and the fragile soul who left us far too soon. He gave the hockey world moments of brilliance that few could ever replicate, inspiring generations of netminders to stand tall in the crease, no matter the oncoming storm. Yet he also left behind a haunting question. How many other athletes, wearing stoic faces and revered by millions, are silently wrestling with their own secret tragedies? Terry Sawchuk's story deserves its place in NHL lore, not simply because of his records, many of which stood for decades, but because it embodies the duality of sports itself, the glorious achievements and the private demons. If you ever find yourself marveling at a goalie's fearless play, remember the man who did it first, with no mask and little fanfare, who bore the scars for all to see but kept the deepest wounds hidden within. And so we ask, does his story resonate as hockey's greatest tale of triumph and tragedy? Do you think it stands among the most poignant moments in all of sports history? Let us know in the comments. Because if Terry Sawchuk taught us anything, it's that every hero's journey is more complicated than what meets the eye, and sometimes the fiercest battles happen long after the final buzzer sounds.